They laughed at the old man in seat 16A. His cheap jacket. His quiet manner. They wanted him removed. Then someone checked his military call sign. 2 F-35 fighter jets appeared beside the plane. The pilots saluted him mid-air. The entire cabin froze in shock. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Thomas Reed sat quietly in seat 16A, his weathered hands resting on his lap. At 82 years old, he looked like any other elderly passenger. His jacket was old but clean. His shoes were worn but polished. His white hair was neatly combed. Nothing about him suggested he was special. He had arrived at JFK Airport 3 hours early, as he always did. Old military habits never fade. The young woman at check-in had processed his ticket without a second glance. Just another elderly traveler heading to Los Angeles. As he waited at the gate, he watched the other passengers. Young businessmen typing on laptops. Families with small children. Teenagers with headphones. Everyone in their own universe. No one looked at him. That was fine. When boarding was called, he walked down the jet bridge with measured steps, his small carry-on bag held carefully. Inside was a change of clothes, his medication, and a small leather journal containing over 300 names. The men and women he had flown with during 3 different wars. Some had gold stars next to them. Those were the ones who never came home. The flight attendant, Jessica, was greeting passengers. She was young, maybe 28, with perfect makeup and a practiced smile. She had worked for the airline for 4 years and had learned to make quick judgments about passengers. When Thomas entered and found seat 16A by the window, he settled in slowly. He clicked his seatbelt and turned his gaze to the window, watching the ground crew work. Jessica walked down the aisle with her tablet, checking seats. She stopped at row 16 and looked at Thomas with a frown. "Excuse me, sir," she said. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the paper. He handed it to her without a word. Jessica scanned it and her frown deepened. "This says business class, but are you sure you're in the right place? Sometimes elderly passengers get confused about their seats." A man across the aisle in seat 16C laughed. His name was Richard Wells, and he measured his worth by what he owned. His Rolex watch cost more than most people earned in 3 months. His suit was custom-tailored. He had made his fortune in real estate, always looking for the next deal. He traveled every week in business class, always impatient. Richard looked at Thomas and saw everything he despised. In his world, if you weren't wealthy and powerful, you didn't matter. "Come on, hurry this up," Richard said, checking his watch. "We're already delayed. Just move him to economy so we can leave. Some of us have important meetings." Thomas looked at Jessica with calm blue eyes that had seen more than she could imagine. Those eyes had watched missiles streak through dark skies. They had seen cities burning below. They had looked into the faces of dying friends. But now they just looked tired. "My ticket says 16A, Thomas said quietly. "That's where I'm sitting." "Sir, I'm just trying to help," Jessica said, her voice tight with impatience. "Business class tickets are very expensive. Are you sure someone didn't make a mistake when booking your flight?" "No mistake," Thomas said quietly. Richard Wells rolled his eyes. "For heaven's sake, this is ridiculous. Look at him. Does he look like he belongs in business class? My time is valuable. I have important meetings in Los Angeles." Other passengers began to stir. A woman in row 17 sighed loudly. A businessman in row 15 closed his laptop with an annoyed snap. Jessica called her supervisor, Mr. Chen, on the radio. "I need you at row 16, please. We have a situation." Mr. Chen arrived quickly. He was a tall man with a serious face and 20 years of airline experience. He looked at Thomas and then at Jessica. "What's the problem?" he asked. "This passenger is in 16A, but I think there might be a seating error," Jessica said. "His ticket is valid, but I'm concerned he might be confused." Mr. Chen looked at Thomas. "Sir, do you understand where you are?" "I'm on flight 847 to Los Angeles," Thomas said. "My seat is 16A. See?" Richard Wells said loudly. "He's confused. Just move him. We've been sitting here for 20 minutes already." Mr. Chen made a decision. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move to economy class. We'll sort this out at the gate." Thomas took a slow breath. He had been a fighter pilot. He had flown in 3 wars. He had faced enemy missiles and survived crashes. But he had never learned to fight against disrespect with anger. He simply nodded and began to unbuckle his seatbelt. In the back of the plane, in seat 28B, a young man named Marcus was watching everything. Marcus was 25 years old and worked at the National Aviation Museum in Washington, D.C. He had grown up with stories of military aviation. His grandfather had been a mechanic on B-17 bombers during World War II. His uncle had served in the Navy, working on aircraft carriers. Marcus himself had tried to join the Air Force, but a medical condition with his eyesight had disqualified him from pilot training. So instead, he studied aviation history. He read every book he could find about fighter pilots. He knew the stories of Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier, of the Tuskegee Airmen fighting for respect and their country, of the Wild Weasel pilots who hunted enemy missiles in Vietnam. He had memorized the names of legendary call signs: Maverick, Viper, Ghost Rider, Spectre, Reaper. Something about the old man bothered Marcus. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made his historian's instincts wake up. The way Thomas sat so straight despite his age. The way his eyes stayed calm even when people were rude to him. The way his hands never shook, even though he was 82 years old. Marcus had interviewed dozens of military veterans for the museum's oral history project. He recognized the bearing, the discipline, the quiet strength that never completely faded. And there was something else. On Thomas's worn jacket, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was a small pin. Marcus squinted. It was an Air Force pin, but not a common one. It looked like a squadron emblem, old and tarnished. Marcus pulled out his phone. He had a friend named Sarah who worked at the regional FAA office in New York. They had met at an aviation conference 2 years ago and stayed in touch. Sarah had access to databases that could identify pilots and their service records. It was a long shot, but Marcus had learned to trust his instincts. He sent her a quick text: "Hey Sarah, weird question. I'm on flight 847 out of JFK, gate B12. There's an old guy there kicking out of business class. Name is Thomas Reed. White hair, about 82 years old. Can you check if that name means anything in aviation? He's wearing an old military pin on his jacket. Something feels off about this situation." Sarah Miller was at her desk at the FAA regional office in Long Island, drinking her 3rd cup of coffee and reviewing flight plans for the afternoon. She was 31 years old, a civilian air traffic control specialist with 10 years of experience. Her father had been an Air Force colonel, so she had grown up around military aviation. She understood the culture, the respect, the traditions. When Marcus's text arrived, she smiled. Marcus was always curious about old pilots. She typed the name, Thomas Reed, into the military aviation database. It was a routine search, the kind she did a dozen times a week when pilots filed flight plans or when there were questions about credentials. The search took a few seconds. The computer processed the name through millions of records. Then the screen changed. A red warning appeared. The kind of warning Sarah had only seen a handful of times in her career. The file was marked classified, level 6 security clearance required. Below that, in smaller text, historical combat records, authorized personnel only. Sarah's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. Level 6 clearance was serious. That was reserved for special operations personnel, intelligence officers, and certain high-ranking officials. She only had level 3 clearance, which was standard for her position. But there was a basic information window that she could access. She clicked on it, her hand trembling slightly. Sarah's heart started racing. Ghost Rider. She knew that name. Every person who grew up in a military family knew that name. It was a legend, a story told in hushed voices at air shows and military reunions. Ghost Rider was the pilot who flew impossible missions. The pilot who went into enemy territory when no one else would go. The pilot who flew through storms and missile fire and darkness and always came back. She immediately called her supervisor, Colonel Martinez. He was a former Air Force officer who had served for 28 years before retiring and joining the FAA. He had flown F-16s during the Gulf War and had commanded a fighter wing before his retirement. He was one of the few people in civilian aviation who still maintained connections with active military operations. "Colonel, we have a situation," Sarah said, her voice urgent. "There's a passenger on Flight 847 at JFK, Gate B12. His name is Thomas Reed. His call sign was Ghost Rider." There was complete silence on the phone for at least 5 seconds. Sarah could hear Colonel Martinez's breathing stop, then start again. "Say that again," he said slowly. "Say the call sign again." "Ghost Rider, sir. Colonel Thomas James Reed. Retired Air Force. 312 combat missions. The database flags him as level 6 classified." "Dear God," Colonel Martinez whispered. "He's still alive. We all thought he had passed away years ago. He just disappeared after retirement." "Sir, what do you want me to do?" Colonel Martinez's voice became sharp and commanding, the voice of a military officer taking charge of a critical situation. "Listen to me very carefully, Sarah. First, get me a direct line to the captain of Flight 847. I don't care what frequency you have to use. Find me that captain right now. Second, contact the Air National Guard at Stewart Air Base. Tell them we need an immediate scramble. 2 F-35s. Full dress formation. Tell them this is a code honor protocol. They'll understand. Third, notify JFK Tower that Flight 847 is not to move until I personally clear it. If they've already pushed back from the gate, tell them to stop. Fake a mechanical issue if you have to. That plane does not move until we show Colonel Reed the respect he's earned. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Sarah said, already typing commands into her computer. "And Sarah," Colonel Martinez added, his voice softer now. "If even half the stories about Ghost Rider are true, that man in seat 16A has saved more lives than we can count. He flew missions that no one else would fly. He volunteered for operations that were essentially suicide runs. And he came back every time. Every single time. We owe him more than we can ever repay." Sarah worked fast. She patched through to JFK Tower and explained the situation. The tower supervisor, a man who had served in the Navy, immediately understood. He contacted Flight 847 and ordered them to hold at the gate for a mechanical inspection. Then Sarah called Stewart Air Base. The operations officer who answered listened to her explanation, put her on hold for 30 seconds, then came back on the line. "Ma'am, we have 2 F-35s ready to fly. Pilots are being briefed now. They'll be airborne in 7 minutes. Provide us with Flight 847's flight path and altitude, and we'll coordinate an intercept. This is an honor, ma'am. A real honor." Back on the plane, Thomas was standing in the aisle. He picked up his small bag from under the seat. He looked at Jessica and Mr. Chen and gave them a polite nod. "I'll move," he said. "No trouble." Richard Wells smirked. Finally. Some people just don't know their place. The cockpit doors suddenly opened. Captain Williams stepped out. He was holding a radio handset, and his face was pale. The co-pilot, Jennifer Park, stood behind him looking confused. "Mr. Chen," Captain Williams said. "Stop everything. Right now." Mr. Chen turned. "Captain. We're just relocating a passenger to resolve a seating issue." "Which passenger?" Captain Williams asked. "The elderly gentleman in 16A. Thomas Reed." Captain Williams looked at Thomas. He stared for a long moment. Then he did something no one expected. He stood at attention and saluted. The entire cabin went silent. "Colonel Reed," Captain Williams said, his voice shaking slightly. "Sir, I just received a call from FAA Command. I have been informed of who you are and what you've done for this country. On behalf of this crew and this airline, I apologize for any disrespect you have experienced." Thomas slowly returned the salute. "That's not necessary, Captain." "Yes, sir, it is," Captain Williams said. He turned to the cabin and picked up the intercom microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I need to share something important with all of you. The man in seat 16A is Colonel Thomas Reed, United States Air Force, retired. He is a decorated combat veteran who served this nation for 35 years. Passengers began to pay attention. Phones were lowered. Conversations stopped. Captain Williams continued. Colonel Reed flew 312 combat missions. He has been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Silver Star, and the Air Force Cross. His call sign was Ghost Rider. He is a true American hero, and he is flying with us today." Richard Wells turned white. Jessica covered her mouth with her hand. Mr. Chen closed his eyes in shame. The captain wasn't finished. "Colonel Reed's presence on this aircraft has been recognized by the United States Air Force. We have been instructed to delay our departure momentarily for a very special reason. When we take off, we will have a military escort. This is extremely rare, ladies and gentlemen. What you are about to witness is a display of respect and honor that few people ever get to see." Thomas looked out the window. His heart was beating faster now. He hadn't expected this. He had just wanted to fly to Los Angeles quietly, to visit his daughter and his grandchildren. He hadn't wanted attention. He had spent the last 25 years of his retirement being invisible, being just another old man. But the military never forgets its own. Never. In the distance, two small dots appeared in the sky, coming from the north. They grew larger with incredible speed. Within seconds, passengers could see them clearly. Two F-35 Lightning fighter jets, the most advanced combat aircraft in the world, were approaching the commercial airliner. The jets were magnificent. Their angular, geometric shapes looked like something from the future. Their gray paint seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, giving them an almost supernatural appearance. They moved with a grace and power that took everyone's breath away. The F-35 on the left side pulled alongside the airliner with precision that seemed impossible. The jet was so close that passengers could see every detail: the weapons pylons under the wings, the sensor arrays on the nose, the American flag painted on the tail. Most incredibly, they could see the pilot in the cockpit, his helmet reflecting the afternoon sun. The second F-35 took position on the right side, matching the formation perfectly. The two fighters held their positions as if they were welded to the airliner's wings. The skill required was extraordinary. At 300 miles per hour, even a small mistake could be catastrophic. But these pilots flew with absolute confidence. Inside the cockpit of the left F-35, Captain Jake "Hawk" Morrison was experiencing the most important moment of his career. He was 29 years old with 800 flight hours in the F-35. When the scramble order came through, his commanding officer had pulled him aside. "Hawk, there's an Air Force legend on a commercial flight. His call sign was Ghost Rider. You're going to show him the respect he deserves. This is the honor of your career. Hawk had heard the stories during flight school. Ghost Rider was the pilot who had flown in Vietnam, the Gulf War, and the Balkans. 3 wars spanning 35 years. More combat hours than almost anyone in Air Force history. Now Hawk was flying formation with that man. He made micro-adjustments with his stick, keeping his F-35 exactly 50 feet from the airliner's wing. Then he turned his head and looked directly at the row of windows. He could see an old man sitting by the window in row 16. White hair. Weathered face. But sitting perfectly straight with clear, sharp eyes. That was Ghost Rider. That was the legend. Hawk raised his right hand and brought it up to his helmet in the crispest, most perfect military salute he had ever given. He held it there, his arm rigid, his fingers straight. On the right side, Captain Lisa Hawk II Chin did the same. She was 27, one of the few female fighter pilots in her squadron. During her quick research before takeoff, she had discovered that in 1972, Ghost Rider had risked his life protecting a medical evacuation helicopter rescuing a downed pilot. The helicopter pilot was a woman, one of the first female pilots in military service. Ghost Rider had flown through heavy fire for 45 minutes, drawing enemy fire away from the helicopter. He had been hit multiple times but kept flying until the helicopter was safe. Lisa felt tears in her eyes as she saluted. She was flying today because men like Ghost Rider had believed in equality and courage. A voice crackled over the cabin speakers, patched through by air traffic control. It was Hawk's voice, steady and full of emotion. Ghost Rider, this is Hawk 1 and Hawk 2 from the 174th Fighter Wing, New York Air National Guard. Sir, it is an absolute honor to fly with you today. The skies remember your name. Your legacy lives in every pilot who wears the uniform. We salute you, sir. The sky is yours, and it always will be. The entire cabin erupted. The tension that had filled the space minutes before shattered completely, replaced by a wave of spontaneous, thunderous applause. Passengers were on their feet, clapping, cheering, many of them crying. Phones were held high to capture the moment. Children were pressed against the windows, their eyes wide with wonder. Thomas Reed sat in his seat, his hands still pressed against the window. The tears on his weathered face caught the sunlight. He looked at the young pilots saluting him, this new generation of warriors who carried on the tradition. He thought about all the pilots he had flown with, all the friends he had lost, all the missions that had seemed impossible. They hadn't been forgotten. The new generation remembered. They honored the old warriors. Thomas raised his right hand slowly. His fingers were bent with arthritis, his arm moved with the stiffness of age, but he formed a salute. It wasn't as crisp as the young pilot's salute, but it carried 35 years of service, 3 wars, 312 combat missions, and a lifetime of sacrifice. The 2 F-35 pilots saw the old colonel salute and felt their hearts break with pride and sadness. This was what service meant. This was why they flew. The F-35s held their formation for another 10 minutes as the commercial airliner climbed to cruising altitude. Then, with a final wing waggle, a traditional pilot's gesture of respect and farewell, the 2 fighters peeled away gracefully. They rolled their aircraft, the sun flashing off their wings, and disappeared into the clouds like silver ghosts. But the moment stayed with everyone on that plane. It would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Captain Williams walked down the aisle to seat 16A. He knelt beside Thomas. "Colonel, I am deeply sorry for what happened. There is no excuse." Thomas shook his head. "People see an old man, Captain. They forget that old men were once young. They forget what we did." The captain stood and turned to Jessica and Mr. Chen. His voice was cold now. "Your behavior was unacceptable. Both of you will meet with me and airline management when we land. There will be consequences. He looked at Richard Wells. "And you, sir? Your comments were cruel and disrespectful. I hope you've learned something today about judging people." Richard Wells couldn't speak. He stared at his expensive shoes, his face burning with shame. The flight took off 30 minutes later. During the journey, passengers kept approaching Thomas. They thanked him for his service. They asked to shake his hand. They took photos with him. Thomas was polite to everyone, but he was clearly tired. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, walked up with her mother. She held out a small American flag. "Mr. Soldier," she said. "Thank you for keeping us safe." Thomas took the flag carefully. He smiled at the little girl, a real smile that made his whole face change. "You're very welcome, sweetheart," he said. "You stay brave and kind, okay?" When the plane landed in Los Angeles 3 hours later, something extraordinary happened. The pilot announced that Colonel Reed would exit first, and everyone should remain seated. As Thomas stood up slowly, using the seat in front of him for support, something unexpected occurred. Every single passenger in the cabin stood up. It started with Marcus in the back. He rose to his feet and began to clap. The family next to him stood immediately, joining the applause. Within seconds, the entire cabin was standing. The applause was deafening in the enclosed space. As Thomas walked down the aisle, every person he passed did something different. Some saluted. Some placed their hands over their hearts. Some reached out to shake his hand. Some simply nodded with tears in their eyes. An elderly woman in row 22, who wore a gold star pin indicating she had lost a son in military service, touched Thomas's arm as he passed. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for bringing some of them home." Thomas stopped and looked at her. He saw the pain in her eyes, the pain that never truly heals. He took her hand gently. "Your son was a hero," he said softly. "They all were. I'm sorry I couldn't bring them all back." The woman nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down her face. Richard Wells sat in his seat, unable to move or look up. His expensive watch felt heavy on his wrist. His designer suit felt like a costume. He had judged a man by his clothes and revealed himself to be worthless in the ways that actually matter. Several passengers had taken photos of him during his earlier comments, and he knew those images would haunt him. But worse than any public humiliation was the shame he felt inside. He had looked at a hero and seen only an inconvenience. Jessica, the flight attendant, stood near the galley with tears running down her face, ruining her makeup. She had treated this man with disrespect. She had judged him, dismissed him, tried to remove him from his rightful seat. She would have to live with that failure for the rest of her career, possibly for the rest of her life. When Thomas reached the door of the aircraft, Captain Williams was waiting there. The young pilot stood at attention and saluted. Thomas returned the salute, then did something unexpected. He held out his hand. Captain Williams shook it, his eyes red. "You did nothing wrong, son," Thomas said. "You corrected the situation when you learned the truth. That takes character. You're going to be a fine captain." At the gate in LAX, an extraordinary sight awaited. An honor guard from the local Air Force base stood at attention. 6 service members in dress uniforms, 3 men and 3 women, stood in perfect formation. An Air Force general, a man with silver hair and 4 stars on his shoulders, waited at attention. As Thomas emerged from the jet bridge, the honor guard snapped to attention. The general saluted. "Colonel Reed, sir," the general said, his voice carrying through the terminal. "I'm General Marcus Patterson, commanding officer of the 61st Air Base Wing. On behalf of the United States Air Force and a grateful nation, welcome to Los Angeles, sir. We wanted to ensure you received the welcome you deserve." Thomas returned the salute. "This really wasn't necessary, General." "With all due respect, sir, it absolutely was necessary," General Patterson said. "You're a legend in the Air Force. Your name is still taught in flight school. Your missions are still studied in tactical courses. Young pilots still hear stories about Ghost Rider and dream of having half your courage. The terminal had stopped moving. Travelers paused with their suitcases. Store workers came out to watch. Airport employees stood at attention. Security guards saluted. A man playing guitar near a coffee shop stopped his song. Someone in the crowd started clapping. Then another person joined. Within seconds, hundreds of people in the terminal were applauding. The sound echoed off the high ceiling, a thunderous tribute to a man who had served in silence and asked for nothing in return. Thomas Reed, the man they had tried to remove from seat 16A, walked through the Los Angeles airport with his head high, escorted by an honor guard, with hundreds of strangers celebrating him. The years fell away for just a moment. He was young again, walking across an airfield after a successful mission. His brothers were with him. The sky was his home, and it always would be. 1 week later, the story had exploded worldwide. Videos of the F-35 escort had been viewed over 100 million times. News organizations across the globe ran features about Colonel Thomas Reed and Ghost Rider. The story touched something deep: heroes walk among us unrecognized, and we should treat everyone with dignity. The airline faced a massive crisis. The CEO issued a public apology and announced mandatory new training for all staff focusing on respect for veterans and elderly passengers. Jessica was suspended for 2 weeks and required to complete 40 hours of sensitivity training. She was given a second chance but warned there would be no third. Mr. Chen was demoted and reassigned to ground crew duties for 6 months with required training. Richard Wells faced the harshest consequences. His company placed him on indefinite leave within 24 hours. 3 days later, he resigned, stating, "I am deeply ashamed. I judged a hero by his clothing and showed myself to be without character. I am stepping down to focus on becoming a better person." He began volunteering at veterans centers, serving meals and helping with job placement programs. The road to redemption would be long. Thomas Reed returned to his quiet life in Oceanside, California. He lived in a small house near the beach that he had bought with his military retirement savings. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 5 years earlier after 54 years of marriage. She had been his anchor through the nightmares and heavy memories of war. He had 2 children, Emily, a doctor in Los Angeles, and David, a teacher in Seattle. His 5 grandchildren called him Papa Ghost, not knowing the significance until the video went viral. Then Emily explained that Papa wasn't just their grandfather, he was a hero who had saved many lives. After the incident, Thomas's phone rang constantly. News organizations, veterans groups, book publishers, and Hollywood producers all wanted his attention. He politely declined most requests. He agreed to 1 military history podcast interview and 1 speech at the local Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall. Mostly, he wanted his routine back. He liked to sit on his porch in the evening, watching planes fly overhead, identifying them by their sound. He still kept a journal, as he had for 57 years. Some nights it was just the weather and dinner. Other nights it was painful memories, missions that went wrong, friends who didn't return, young faces now just names on memorial walls. On his wrist, he wore the simple leather band. Inside, written in faded ink, were 3 names: Danny Deacon Miller, Mike Hammer Rodriguez, and Carlos Thunder Santos. His wingmen from Vietnam who didn't make it home. He touched the band every day. It reminded him why he had kept flying, why he had volunteered for mission after mission. He flew for the ones who couldn't fly anymore. He lived for the ones who didn't make it home. He touched the band gently. "They still remember us," he whispered to the sky. After all these years, they still remember. 2 months after the incident, Marcus received a package from Oceanside. Inside was an F-4 Phantom pilot's wing insignia from Vietnam and a letter from Thomas. "Dear Marcus, you saw something others missed and took action. This pin belonged to my friend Danny Miller. I've carried it for 55 years. It's time it went to someone who will keep these stories alive. Keep reminding people that heroes walk among us. Thank you for seeing me that day. With respect, Colonel Thomas James Reed, Ghost Rider. Marcus had the pin mounted in a display case on his museum desk. Every day, visitors asked about it, and he told them the story of Colonel Reed and Flight 847. The museum created a new exhibit called The Ones Who Came Home, featuring veterans who returned from service and lived quiet lives. It became one of the museum's most popular exhibits. Marcus never moved that pin from his desk. Years later, as museum curator, it remained there, a reminder that heroes don't always announce themselves, but they deserve recognition when we find them. The story became more than a viral video, it became a movement. Veterans organizations reported increased donations. Schools invited local veterans to speak. Airports began programs to recognize military passengers. The hashtag See the Person reminded people to look beyond appearances. Thomas received thousands of letters from across the world. Veterans thanking him. Young people thanking him for his service. Teachers using his story to teach respect. Parents discussing the video with their children. Thomas read every letter. And slowly, something healed inside him. For decades, he had carried survivor's guilt. But these letters showed him that his survival had meaning. By living with dignity and carrying the memory of fallen friends, he had honored them. By having his story told, he had helped millions understand the importance of respect and recognizing humanity in everyone. One evening, 6 months after the incident, Thomas sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. A commercial jet flew overhead, its navigation lights blinking against the darkening sky. Thomas raised his coffee cup in a silent toast to the plane and all the passengers aboard heading home to their own lives and stories. He hoped they were all being treated with kindness. The leather band on his wrist caught the last rays of sunlight. He touched it gently. "We did okay, didn't we?" he whispered to the names inside. "We served with honor. We came home. And maybe we helped make the world a little better." The wind carried his words toward the ocean, toward the horizon where earth and sky meet. Somewhere up there, in that vast blue expanse, the spirits of all the warriors who never came home were flying. Forever young. Forever free. Forever honored by those who remembered. Heroes walk among us every day. They don't wear capes or seek attention. They're the quiet ones who served and returned to normal life. The next time you see an elderly person struggling, or sitting alone, or being treated poorly, remember Thomas Reed in seat 16A. Remember that every old person was once young. Every quiet person has a story. Every face has seen things you cannot imagine. Treat people with respect and kindness. Because you never know when you might be standing next to a legend. The old warriors may be gray now. They may move slowly. But inside, they still carry the fire. They still remember the missions. They still hear the names of fallen friends. And somewhere, high above the clouds, the Ghost Rider still flies.